What's going on, guys? So we're going to talk about what Chinese boxing is and why it's important to what we do and what any person who practices Kung Fu can and should be doing. So one of the first things that we have to start with is kind of defining what even Chinese boxing is. So Chinese boxing is actually an English term that comes from the English being in southern China going, oh, this is how the Chinese go about boxing. Keep in mind, at this time, boxing was the bare knuckle affair that we see in the historical texts and documents of the 1700s and the 1800s, where boxing was not just, it wasn't the Marquess of Queensberry rules. This is bare knuckle. This is oftentimes handshake. As far as the rules and conventions of it go, definitely regional conventions. Clearly in France, boxing was considered to be involving kicking, whereas in England they had a bias against kicking. Boxing almost always included some sort of takedowns. It was not illegal, it was not against the rules. The rules that we have on document, at least, it was not against the rules to hold somebody and hit them. The biggest thing was you don't hit a man when he's down. So the British were using the term Chinese boxing to differentiate it from English boxing, just the same way that they differentiated the French style of boxing. So boxing really just meant fist fighting, and it was generally just as distinguished from wrestling, even though boxing often included some aspects of wrestling. And this is important for us because when we look at the traditional Chinese martial arts and arts derived from Chinese arts, what we see is primarily striking with some additional grappling type movements, and generally a pretty large lack of any kind of ground fighting. So it fits within the Old English definition fairly well. Now, as far as what we do, my background before Wing Chun, and Wing Chun is often referred to as Chinese boxing because it looks very much like the old bare knuckle styles. It's that short striking, that middle guard is not that dissimilar, et cetera, et cetera. But resemblances aside, my background was in Kempo. Now, what we call Kempo is just the Japanese reading of this character set, which is Chuanfa. And my Chinese is horrible. Please excuse me if I butcher that pronunciation. In Cantonese, Kun Fat, and again, Chinese pronunciation is very bad. And what we see is this actually means fist, and this means law or method. And so the idea behind this is it's a fist method, and this was actually a pretty common term in China, especially in southern China, for the martial arts as a whole, because most people, like the term martial arts that we use, like in Chinese you think wushu, but wushu was not that popular of a term, not for a while. And Chuanfa, Mandarin speaking, was a bit more popular earlier on before wushu became the more popular term. And there are a host of popular terms, as is wont to happen in neocultural diaspora. You're going to have different groups of people referring to things in different ways, and some are going to be more umbrella terms and some are going to be more likely to use the very specific skill set names. But the reason that Kempo is kind of referred to as that in the US is because the guy that brought it, James Matosa, brought Kempo to the US, and he was promoting it as a Japanese art, and it seemed to be basically like some Japanese jiu-jitsu stuff with some additional Okinawa karate pasted in on top of that. And then William Chow got his hands on it, added his family kung fu style on top of it, on top of Western boxing and things like that. And he's the one that kind of started terming it Kempo more than Matosa did. And what we're looking at again is just this idea of this hybrid kind of Chinese-Japanese thing, but As time went on, it became more and more striking related, less and less grappling related. Much of the jiu-jitsu stuff kind of started flowing out of the Kempo, and we started seeing more of the striking, and it became very, very Chinese in some circles. And therefore, Kempo was even more that. Well, the Japanese use Kempo to refer to Chinese martial arts. And of course, Okinawan martial arts were originally Chinese martial arts, so it all circles back to Chinese boxing. So between our Wing Chun and my background in Kempo, which comes into the kickboxing classes and the MMA discussions, what we have is a large platform for the overall concept of Chinese boxing. Now, when you are practicing Chinese boxing of any sort, even derivatives, karate, taekwondo, things like that, you have to understand that there are kind of 4 factors or 4 elements. There's different ways to say that, of what needs to be going on during the practice. Now, these are not always going to be given equal weight. They are going to be weighted in different ways depending on what the style is designed for, what context it's designed for. But largely what we are going to be looking at, and this is a very classical breakdown that you see over and over and over again in discussions about Chinese martial arts as a cultural phenomenon, as a big categorical thing. Chinese martial arts, you're going to see Da, Ti, Na, and Shui, and again, those are Mandarin, Da, Tek, Na, and Sui. So each of these has a meaning. So Da literally is just basically hand striking. And of course, obviously the associated defense is kind of lumped in there. They're not specifically speaking about the defense, they're talking about the offensive measures. So generally striking. And then T, Tech, kicking. Now, I have never particularly liked the idea of separating kicking from striking. In my book, kicking is still striking because by definition of what a strike is, you strike with the leg or the foot. But even so, kicking is often seen as kind of an adjunct skill set because of the way that it changes your structure and balance, and how kicking changes a lot of your tactics and what's available and what's not, the risks you take, etc. And so pretty much everybody has some kind of striking in there. Kicking may be something as low, if you look at like Wing Chun, which has a very low priority on kicking, or say Southern Praying Mantis, the Hakka lineage is a praying mantis. You see very, very, very little kicking, and a lot of the leg work ends up being more like leg checking. But still important to understand how stuff like that works. And then we get into Na, which of course comes from the practice of Chin Na, which just means to seize and hold. This is holding. And I guess I'll put the ing on there for you. And then Shui is shorthand for throwing, from Shui Jiao, which is the Chinese wrestling art, which is really old. It might be China's oldest martial art. So when we look at these factors, striking, of course, is going to be the bulk of your boxing. Kicking, kicking can be as a large part or small part as is the purview of the conflicts you're trying to solve. Holding, this becomes very, 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 very important, and this can mean a ton of things. And again, if we look into the Chin Na practice, there are some people who just belligerently say Wing Chun does not contain Chin Na, and there's other people who swear up and down that it does. There are people who say, well, it comes at least in part from White Crane, and White Crane is known for its Chin Na, so it has to have Chin Na. Look, the fact is we don't know much about it, and the majority of Wing Chun people kind of do a poor job of Chin Na, but I will say this: Lap Sao, pulling, kind of part of it. Chambering, referred to as gathering, that's part of it. Our overhead elbow ends in a gathering motion. This motion from Chung Kyu is often looked at as gathering a receiving hand. So there are definitely aspects of Wing Chun, and even if you just look at some of the control positions we use for bridging, kind of starts fitting into this category. Now, Chin Na tends to start looking a little bit more like what we think of as like perhaps jujitsu, where you start seeing a lot more wrist locks and arm locks, and of course they play with pressure points, and there's also vital point striking in a lot of that, because oftentimes striking helps you enter into a grappling position. And again, the majority of this, even if things get taken to the ground, they tend to be more arresting holds. They don't tend to be, the submissions, especially the more savvy modern stuff that we see in BJJ and catch wrestling. And then, of course, the shuai, the throwing, that can be anything from, simple trip and sweep takedowns, which are very, very common in these Chinese boxing arts, all the way up to actual, hooking and throwing type techniques that you see in Shuai Jiao. And again, depending on the particular art or the particular teacher and school, there may be more or less focus given to these things. And so when we are training, whether we are training in Wing Chun, whether we are training in another art, what we need to be looking at is how we are fulfilling this blueprint for what is the culture of Chinese martial arts. Where does it fit into that picture? Are we stripping things out? Are we just weighting things in one way versus another? These are all important questions to ask ourselves and how we're building this art. And keep in mind, right, like in our case, Wing Chun, it is a living art. This is not something that we have taken a snapshot of the 1950s and we have to do things exactly the way they did them in the 1950s. It is a framework, it is a model that we must take the ball with and run into the future with and go, hey, what works well, what works consistently across multiple contexts, what contexts are no longer viable based on the modern atmosphere or the arena that we're applying it in, and how must that change? Where does it change the art, and where does it just change the training? All of these things are important questions to ask ourselves on how we're building this. And developing your training program around these four aspects will give you a much, much better leg up on entering, say, in our case, into the MMA community, right? I came to Wing Chun from MMA. Now, granted, it was just amateur level stuff and, nothing major, but the fact is that changes how you look at fighting. And if your art can't keep up with whatever your expectations are, your arena, your expected test, then you either have to make changes or find a new art. And I don't believe that we need to find a new art. I believe, in fact, that we have what we need within the art. We need to apply it differently. And for us, we can take this blueprint of Wing Chun and we can add in, of course, some of the old Kempo stuff, although that'll probably happen more in the kickboxing and the MMA-oriented classes. But if we start looking at this stuff, this part right here is going to start giving us those transitional pieces into the grappling aspect, and where we start overlapping with the catch wrestling that we teach, right? These up here, we start adding in on top of the kickboxing classes, and between the Savate, the Kempo, the Wing Chun, right, and just the general MMA, we start having this nice layered striking approach. And so again, for us, for our school, for Black Sin Boxing, we put Wing Chun in the center court because that is our close range stuff, and we bring the kickboxing to the outside of the reach and the catch wrestling to the very closest body to body range. If we have that expansion and contraction in there, and you can do this if you're not a Wing Chun guy, that's fine. You can apply this to your own art, right? You start looking at how these pieces flow in and out from each other, and it is those transitional pieces that are going to kind of often make or break your ability to deal in a mixed fight, whether it's an MMA match or if it's a street fight or a self-defense situation where you're not limited and governed by a specific rule set that tells you what you can and can't do. And so we need to be spending some time really analyzing our art and where these things fit in all together and how they interplay and overlap with each other. So I think that's about all I've got for you today. I have a feeling that I'm getting onto the verge of rambling. So we're gonna go ahead and cut it off before I get to that point. And I will talk to you guys next time. If you feel like I left anything out or you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comments below and we'll talk later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. In the links down below, you can find our social media and I encourage you to follow us there. Take a look at our blog where we have articles that go into depth that we just can't do in our video productions. And on top of that, go to our Amazon store, pick out a shirt that you like, and every little bit helps. If you're ever in the Phoenix area, look us up. Come in for a class, come in for open mat, whatever. Love to see you down here. You can find all our contact info on the website. Talk to you guys in the next one. Good journey.